Hey, good to see you again. Yeah, so I'll be arguing the pro for this side. I'll just start this speech with some couple of opening remarks. The first of which is just a definition of veganism. That would be against the consumption of animals or animal products. These include things like meat and leather, which require the death of animals, and also milk, which doesn't require the death of animals, but certainly the use of animal products. So I'm against all of those things. That's what this country would not be doing. How would a country go vegan? So this debate is not about whether or not we would force a country to or any individual to go vegan, but rather if they all decided to go vegan, would that thing be beneficial? And here's how I think it's likely to work. It's obviously not going to happen overnight. That would be rather irrational of the people of the country to do so. It would likely be phased in over a period of like 15 to 20 years. That gives time for businesses to readjust. It gives time for people to adjust their budgets or the way in which they're feeding themselves. I don't have to support the silliest version of this topic. This topic is simply an analysis of the benefits that are likely to occur because of that. Finally, to note, this isn't a debate about whether or not veganism is healthy. I've done a bit of research. It's the position of the American Dietetic Association that vegan diets are sufficiently healthy and nutritionally adequate. And even if you don't take that word for it, just an intuition for it, you could realize that hunter-gatherer societies of humans lived for quite a while without the consumption of meat, which means our bodies are fairly capable of doing so. Importantly, eating meat often contributes to a significant number of bodily harms, for example, increased likelihood of higher cholesterol and cancer and stuff like that. So this is likely beneficial there. So what this debate is going to be about from my perspective then is I'm going to make three arguments. Firstly, an agricultural argument. Secondly, a climate argument. And thirdly, a moral argument. I'll do that in my next speech. I'll just pass over to you for opening remarks.
There's no one right way to eat for everyone. And yet this debate asks exactly what would happen if we tried to enforce the same. While you say that this isn't about enforcement, for an entire country to go vegan, there would necessarily have to be some central body that was enforcing veganism, whether it was a culture that simply enforced the unavailability of animal products. The net result is the same. People who did not wish to become vegan would still have no choice but to do so within this hypothetical country. I'll be making three primary arguments against the idea that it would be beneficial for a country to go vegan. In fact, in support of the proposition that it would not be beneficial for a country to go vegan. First of all, the vegan diet is an ideological diet, not a natural one. Vegan diets necessarily require artificial means to sustain themselves. Therefore, the vegan diet would not be viable in any country where any significant portion of the population did not have the means available to either afford or even find artificial means to receive certain critical vitamins and nutrients that are not available in an animal product-free diet. Second, vegan diets are not appropriate for a wide variety of portions of the populace. Some of this has to do with geography. There are countries on Earth where a vegan diet would not work, and a lot of them simply because, for instance, of the availability of sunlight. There are other countries on Earth where a vegan diet would not work simply because of the skin hue of the majority of people who live there. Third, vegan diets are not appropriate for an entire society because veganism is associated with lower testosterone in men, lower sperm count. It is largely considered inappropriate for pregnant women and infants, absent, again, significant artificial supplementation, and the type of plant matter that's necessary for a vegan to sustain oneself has a drastic ecological effect on the entirety of a biosphere. Finally, enforcing a single diet of any sort, let alone veganism, on an entire populace presents an entire parade of horribles, whether it becomes to enforcement, scope of government responsibility for individual health and individual choices, and government management of the health problems that naturally occur with a non-supplemented vegan diet.
So obviously people have severe health issues will not be eating in the same way. The government also provides supplements as they do under the status quo. This is not a motion about the government forcing you to eat a certain way. And here's the reason why. I'm going to make 3 persuasive arguments to believe that it would be moral and good for you to go vegan. Everyone should see my speech and then be persuaded that that is something that they should do. This is not a government enforcement debate. If it were, it would say so in the title. On my agricultural argument, the context of this debate is one of an increasing global population and the threat of which that comes with that, increased likelihood that there will be food and water insecurities, as we've already seen in various other countries around the world, and is likely to hit countries like Australia very soon. This is a way to stop that problem. So the reason that is the case is that to make 1 kilogram of meat, for example, beef, it takes around 5,000 to 20,000 liters of water and about that much land as well. To make 1 kilogram of grain, it costs 500 to 4,000 liters of water. And the reason for this is that when you make beef, you have to not only grow the grain, but then feed that grain to the beef as well. That is a reason to believe that there is significantly less land, water, energy, and other resource that goes into the creation of grain, not just meat. And this is an argument that responds to exactly what you were saying, stuff about sunlight, stuff about geography. It's a lot harder to grow meat than it is to grow grain. And the reason for that then is that argument that you made is not particularly persuasive. So what are the harms of this? Firstly, it takes longer to do so, and secondly, uses much more resources. And in the context that I just pointed out, it's likely to be harmful. The benefits of changing would be as follows. Firstly, more arable land set up for housing and also just like other grain production. Secondly, more sustainable land, water, and food use, which means we're unlikely to run in those problems that I detailed before. Thirdly, it would be much more reliable because you don't have to worry about your livestock dying. It's much easier to take care of crop of things because they're not going to wander off as whereas cows would. And finally, grains have a much higher shelf life and can be transported across the sea without the same support that meat does. That means it's easier to help those other countries that have those grains, have those geographical problems you pointed to. The final thing I'm going to talk about in this speech is your claim. I know you haven't fully made the argument, but just to address the claim that it's ideological and it's artificial. One, that's a naturalistic fallacy. Just because something is artificial doesn't mean it's bad. For example, Panadol, that is something that's artificial, but you wouldn't say that's bad. But secondly, it's simply not the case that it's artificial. We already know that hunter-gatherers use these types of diets, and we're perfectly fine because our bodies are pre-designed to either be herbivores or omnivores. We can be herbivores and be just fine about it. There's no reason to believe that that is a problem there. I'll pass the mic.
Exhibit A against your statement that there have been societies that existed without animal products. See, I have a slight underbite, so my canine teeth are a little bit more prominent than some other people's, but the fact is human beings do have the teeth that are necessary for ripping animal flesh, and the reason for that is every society that has ever thrived has thrived using animal products. There has been no documented society in the history of mankind that has thrived without animal products. Let me repeat that. There has been no human society in the history of mankind that has actually thrived without animal products. Now, let's talk more about ecological impact. You see, you say it takes less water to make grain. It's easier to grow grain than meat. But you're talking about grains as a whole. Vegans need a very specific set of grains to get the nutrients that are common in animal products, but that are hard to find in plant products. And those specific plants have a drastic ecological impact. You want to talk about poorer countries? Let's look at Brazil. Brazil has already experienced vast deforestation to grow what? Soybeans. Where does the massive demand for soybeans come from? Vegetarian and vegan diets in the West from people who can afford the soybeans. The Cerrado, which is sort of an upside-down Amazon. A lot of its plant life is underground, and it's responsible for just as much of the cleaning of our atmosphere of carbon dioxide as the Amazon is, has already lost 1/2 of its native vegetation to soybean plantations. Initially, soybeans can be cultivated without fertilizer, but the soil soon needs those to nourish its crop. I'm getting this from the World Wildlife Foundation here. In the case of Bolivia, by the late 1990s, more than 100,000 hectares of former soybean lands had to be abandoned because soybeans could not be grown there anymore because the soybeans had sapped the nutrients so much. By the way, guess what those lands are used for now? Cattle grazing lands, because the cattle turned out to be more sustainable than soybeans. You say that just because it's artificial doesn't mean it's bad. While that is true, artificial means less available. One of the vitamins that is deficient in a vegan diet, and the vegans are vastly deficient in, is B12. There are only 4 companies on the entire face of planet Earth that make artificial B12, and 3 of them are in China. Any country that tried to enforce veganism upon its citizens, which, by the way, is implied by the resolution, would have to get it from China and would have to expend a great deal of money on these artificial means instead of natural ones.
It is not in the motion that this is a government thing. People would be persuaded by my arguments. You're not debating the topic. Also, that entire speech was just a bunch of lies, and summary Google search would prove it to you. Firstly, one of the largest countries in the world, India, one of the fastest growing countries in the world, India, has one of the highest vegan and vegetarian populations in the entire world. They are quite successful right now. We also know that there were lots of hunter-gatherer societies that did not have access to animals, and you want to know where they would have been in America, which is one of the reasons why there was such suffering when English settlers came to America, because they'd been living around animals that transported diseases that Americans were not, or those Native Americans were not exposed to. Those are factual things about the world. You're simply lying. The next claim you make is to say, well, soybeans are really bad for Brazil. I looked it up. Soybeans take 502 gallons of water per pound to create of soybeans. That is way different to the up to 20,000 liters of water to make a kilo of beef. Yes, soybeans aren't great, but they're much, much, much better than beef. You're not existing in reality here, man. Okay, second argument on climate change. 1/3 of all carbon emissions made by humans come from the production of meat. If we were to stop the use of meat, these things would be cut by about 60%. Presumably, if a large country, for example, America, and again, this is about whether or not a country, we're not talking about the worst country in the world, we're talking about a median country, means that those carbon emissions are very likely to decrease. The important thing to note here is that other things I've looked up is that a family of 4 that eats meat 2 to 3 times a week, of the carbon emissions that can be attributed to that couple of kilos of meat that they eat, that produces more carbon than it does for them to drive 2 cars every day to work. There is a huge emission of carbons that comes from the use of meat and the production of meat that is manifestly contributing to climate change, and importantly, destroying the environments that you just said you cared about. So if it is the production of meat that is something that is bad and is hurting those environments by the own metric that you just set me, that is something that you should not be able to support. And also, I just want to reiterate, the previous argument that I made about water consumption is about the most important resource that we have, that there is currently a shortage of because a growing population that we have. If we continue down the path of the overconsumption and production of meat, we are going to run out of viable drinking water, and as a function of that, people are going to die. This is a way to stop that.
You keep referencing water as a touchstone for sustainability. I would remind both you and the audience that water is a renewable resource naturally. You may have missed water cycle day in 7th grade science class. Furthermore, 70% of the earth is water, and desalination technology is rapidly advancing. What is not a naturally renewable resource is soil. I've already talked about how the production of soybeans in particular, but also the other kinds of grains that are necessary for a vegan diet. Leafy greens such as kale that do not naturally occur in vast quantities, cabbage, legumes. These things sap soil much more rapidly than more naturally occurring fruits and vegetables that are part of an omnivorous diet that is normal for human beings. Now, your statement about India, I would point out that India is not traditionally a vegan nation, but a vegetarian nation. There is a great difference between vegetarianism and veganism, and the difference is dairy and eggs. Lacto-ovo vegetarians experience significantly fewer of the vitamin deficiencies that vegetarians do. Now, that brings me around to what I touched on earlier, is that there are large portions of any population for whom the vegan diet is not going to be persuasive by your arguments because it is dangerous for them or could, in fact, kill them. There are several key nutrients that are necessary for human life that do not occur naturally in anything but animals. Vitamin D3, which is the form of vitamin D that is most soluble to humans, does not occur in animals. Vitamin D2 only occurs in animals. Vitamin D2, which occurs in plants, is not metabolized at the same rate. Vitamin B12 only occurs in animal products. We've already discussed how artificial B12 is only produced by a small number of companies. There are people who are naturally prone to B12 deficiency for whom a vegan diet is inappropriate because it can cause severe B12 deficiency, namely people suffering from HIV, celiac disease, people of Northern European descent, and people of African descent. Omega-3 fatty acids they're available in plants, but they're usually counterbalanced by a greater amount of omega-6, and the conversion of omega-3 from plants in the body is significantly less efficient. Carnosine, only available in animal foods. Creatine, only available in animal foods, and significant deficiencies occur in vegetarians. Any member of the populace who was naturally prone to any of these vitamin deficiencies, and we've already pointed to some groups, would be harmed by a policy, whether it's enforced by culture or by a government, that makes natural animal foods less available to them.
All right. Firstly, on water shortages, you claim that desalination plants are a good thing. They actually suck because we tried it in Australia and it doesn't work. Secondly, as I just Googled, there are 1.2 billion people in the world right now who do not have access to water and are going thirsty because of it. It is not a renewable resource in the sense that anyone can have access to it. It's a renewable resource in the sense that it cycles around, but when it becomes dirty or when you have enormous expenditure of it in the production of meat, you run out of it. I didn't miss 7th grade science class because I'm a 4th year science student at university. That's pretty silly from you. But also, you've ignored the other things in the argument I made. It's not just water, even though water is the most important resource on the planet. It's other things like medicine that you would constantly have to be taking care of these cows. It's stuff like you would have to hire guards to protect them, the use of sheepdogs. These are expenses at things that don't need to be used under your side. Also, do not forget adjudicators and audience, the massive amounts of land to grow cows. Not only do you have to use the massive amounts of land to grow beans and grains, you also have to have land for the cows. Those two things feed into each other, which means there is a huge loss under your side of the house. You are not being comparative. Your next claim is about individuals for whom this would be unhealthy for. I would point out that things like legumes have a higher protein density than meat, so that is unlikely to be a persuasive argument there. Your next claim is to be, well, for some people it would be unhealthy. As I pointed out in my first and second speeches, this does not have to be a silly application, right? If there are people who are unhealthy for it, we make allowances for them. The government ought to subsidize things like tablets and supplements for them, as they do right now for people who are suffering. People who have AIDS, people who have celiac disease are the extreme minority. This is an argument about the majority of people in a country and what they should be doing, and as a function of which, how would it be beneficial? The claim that there are some people that this would be unhealthy for is simply an argument for us to make exceptions for them, not that this is a bad motion, in the same way we make exceptions for all other people in all other cultural and governmental institutions. Finally, moral argument. The consumption of meat is something that is unnecessary for the survival of humans. So even if we have to use artificial things like supplements, that is demonstrating that we do not need to kill animals for it, because we know that animals feel pain. We know that they suffer. We know that if you see videos of them being dragged to an abattoir, they are trying to get away because they know exactly what is about to happen to them. Animals may have a lower IQ than humans, but they are not completely stupid. We see the suffering in their eyes and the way in which they have connections to other individuals of their species and their immediate family. This is another living organism that we are killing for no reason. We are artificially inseminating them, perpetually raping female cows so that they are perpetually pregnant and can produce milk. That is something that is immoral and should not be done.
Well, you see, now you've drifted into the moral side of the argument, which goes back to the first thing that I said, which was that veganism is an ideological diet and not a natural diet. We've already shown several times here in this debate that the natural diet for humans is not vegan. We know that by our own bodily cravings. Now, let's talk about protein. This is usually the bugaboo that people have when they attack veganism. I haven't gone there yet. You say that legumes have higher protein density than meat. However, the proteins in legumes are as much as 15 times lower in quality than the proteins that are available in meat. This also goes back to the omega-3 fatty acids and other forms of fatty acids, the saturated fats that are found in legumes, that are found in certain types of grains, significantly lower quality and not digested, not converted nearly as efficiently as the kinds that are found in animals. Now, you've said, you keep going back to this idea that you can have a country that is vegan without some enforcement mechanism. I will say again, because this is the third time I've said it, even if it's just a matter of a vast majority of people in a country deciding we're going to be vegan, you're talking about limiting the availability of animal products to people who would be better served by them. And when you launch into a moral cataclysm like the one you've just presented, you're talking about society enacting a moral judgment upon people who are naturally unable to sustain a vegan diet. Now, let's go back to the broader societal problem that we have when it comes to fertility. Again, you've made this argument about hunter-gatherer societies with absolutely no evidence whatsoever. We know from longitudinal studies that people who with both vegetarian and vegan diets, men in particular, have lower fertility, lower testosterone, lower sperm counts, lower sperm motility. Vegans are lower in all of those categories than even lacto-ovo-vegetarians or ovo-vegetarians. So the vegan diet is not good for a society as a whole, assuming that society wants to continue to reproduce. I suspect that your solution is going to be that humans should therefore not reproduce, and I would leave it to the audience to determine whether it is beneficial for a country of humans to make the decision to undergo a diet that kills many of them, leaves many of them not to thrive, and makes it harder for them to reproduce, whether we should adopt that as a hypothetical country to spare the lives of non-human animals.
The American Dietetic Association. It is our position that these vegan diets are healthy, nutritionally adequate, and may provide health benefits. Also, they do provide all of the appropriate things such as N3 fatty acids, iron, zinc, iodine, calcium, vitamins D and B12, things that you said they don't do. This is a direct quote from the abstract of the Dietetic Association. You are not dealing in reality here, man. You're just doing something that's ideological. Secondly, your claim about legumes having lower quality protein. I mean, I just Googled it. The Nutrition Council says that there is no different, and in fact has an upwards degree of fiber intake for people who are consuming legumes. It's unclear where you're getting that from. Your next claim is to say, well, this is an ideological thing and that's something that's bad. It's not. Things can have ideological bents, but they can also have all of the other huge practical outcomes about the saving of people's lives, about the impact of climate change, about the overuse of water, which is our most important resource, something that you have yet to respond to. Your final claim is to say, well, this is a bit immoral because some people wouldn't get access to it and it's unfair to limit things to those people. One, if my moral argument is true, that is probably something that's less important because this is the life of another thing versus the suffering of something other. And you've given no reason to believe that humans are any more important than animals, especially in the context in which that would just be speciesism, which is just a type of racism. Your next claim is to say, well, and also, I do not, and I've said this like 8 times, I do not have to limit the access that people have to things like supplements. I already identified that if people did this, the government would likely go this way. I identified in my first speech, the market would likely fulfill these things as businesses would transition. We do things right now that help for people on the extremes. We build accessibility affordability rants for public buildings and private buildings. We make sure that people have like welfare and housing when they need it, and soup kitchens. This is the government taking care of people who are diametrically opposed from the norm of others. So when we have those people, we take care of them and we help them. That does not mean that we should not do an action that manifestly helps the vast majority of people in society. As I previously noted, people who are on vegan diets have lower body mass indexes, have lower blood cholesterol, have lower blood pressure, things that are also in the American Dietetics Association abstract. And if you read the report, they go into significantly more detail. Your final claim to say is that there's no example of any society that's ever not eaten meat. Are you kidding me, man? The reason why humans have the digestive system that they do, which is sufficiently long to deal with grains, but sufficiently short to also deal with meat, means that we can consume and live just off of meat. We can have supplements, but as already identified before, we don't need them in the case of things like legumes. You're missing the point of this is a global disaster that is likely to happen in the circumstance of food security that cannot be transported. You are not engaging with reality.
Meat can be transported. It's called refrigeration. That's how we have sushi away from the coast. Now, I am loath to shotgun facts, but you keep referring to a single unnamed study from a single dietary society. So let me correct some of your assertions about the sufficiency of the vegan diet. The American Society for Nutrition, Winston J. Craig of Andrews University, Health Effects of Vegan Diets. N3 fatty acids. Diets that do not include fish, eggs, or sea vegetables generally lack the long chain N3 fatty acids, which are important for cardiovascular health as long as eye and brain function. Vitamin D. In an EPIC Oxford study, vegans had the lowest intake of vitamin D and a value 1/4 that of omnivores. By the way, what you've just described about the human digestive system is omnivorous, not exclusively vegan. Vitamin B12, compared with lacto-ovo-vegetarians and omnivores, vegans typically have lower plasma vitamin B12 concentrations and higher prevalence of vitamin B deficiency. For all of these vitamin deficiencies, every study, whether it's the American Pediatric Association, whether it's the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, whether it is, in this case, the American Society for Nutrition, recommends that vegans eat a diet of fortified foods, foods that have been artificially interjected with these vitamins that are not normally present in their diet. If you do not provide these fortifications, then people are going to suffer from these deficiencies. My quote, by the way, about no culture has thrived on animal-free foods, that's Dr. Weston Price, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. He also found a link between a diet low in animal foods and tooth decay. E.M. Orzalowska, decreased sperm concentration and motility in a subpopulation of vegetarian males at a designated blue zone being a place with normally high lifespans. Lacto-ovo-vegetarians had significantly lower sperm concentration, vegans more so. Dr. Ray Peat is the one who said that proteins in plants rank 15 times lower than high-quality proteins found in animal products. So there's your list of facts for what the vitamin deficiencies are. Now, let's go back to what you said about government. You talk about government taking care of people. People do not choose to be born in need of a handicap ramp. People do not choose to be in need of basic sustenance provided by food stamps. The choice to become vegan is not one the government should have to support or to enforce on others.
Okay, one, you quoted something from Winston J. Craig. You know who he is? The author of the study I've been quoting this entire time, the position of the American Dietetic Association. I've posted the link of which in the bottom. Read the first line of the abstract. It talks about vegetarian and vegan diets. What you've quoted are deficiencies. Read the report. It says things like low blood pressure, low BMI, and other health-related things are more important than those things. The claim is that they are healthy and than sufficient. That is something that's important. But even if that weren't the case, even if they were a little bit damaging, look at the massive harms that are going to accrue if we continue down our current path of overconsumption and overproduction. The massive amount of water loss. Your claim is about, well, we can transport sushi. Bro, you don't have to refrigerate grains, right? They are easier to transport, as I pointed out in my first argument, which also helps your criteria, which was getting it to geographically hard places to get to. These things are easier under my side of the house with grains. These help more people. These waste less water. This does not contribute to climate change as much, which will destroy the world. And to boot, it's the most moral thing to do. Even if the government had to enforce this, it would likely be better. We can do all of these good things right now.
Look at the massive harms that are going to accrue. I'm looking around at a country, a world of 6 billion people that are still eating meat, and these massive harms have not accrued. You're asking me to accept that the world needs to do this to save the world, but the resolution's about a country. One country can't solve the ills you're talking about, but it can visit those ills upon